Jameson.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start it.
So you were Marine Five pilot in the Constitution.
That's not. That was not the right one.
You know, when he made that recording, he did not have his teeth in his mouth, and he was nervous, and he kept talking to Mama about it. He talked to her about all this. She knew everything.
He wanted to make sure that she corrected.
And number,
Is that right, Mama?
that's number 6 and number 3 played.
He died.
You know, they changed all the chicken.
Okay, he switched number 3 and number 6.
Woman other than
Up there, we kept it there. We got the jacket. Yeah. I didn't shoot it off over there. I was sitting
Some out of country.
west
Out of country by.
of that sergeant. And we walked up to the jacket. You know what that guy was? Good. That's I mean bad. I mean it was yummy. They had done all bad things. And the tech sergeant said, well, it's me and you. There's not 4 or 5 of us, but I was a little bit over to the left. Well, right there by that barbed wire. And it had a very big old padlock on that gate. And in the eyes, there was a lot of them still hanging on the wire there. And prisoners in, and some of them been burnt half to prisoners, bushwhackers, flamethrowers, stuff like that. Now that is the thing was terrible. So we went to that gate, and here at first I looked at that gate. Really big old padlock on it. And I got that 45. I didn't, metal, if you shoot 35 bullets at a piece of metal's going to pop. So we got across away from it. And we knew that stuff was going to fall over. And he just took it to that lock, blew that lock off, and we just went all the pieces with a 35 bullets. And he just pushed it open. It wasn't that we just threw the wire. They couldn't get out. Because you could keep your hands through it, but that was square. And they were in there, they were citizens. And they didn't have that to eat. And we had our K-rifles. And we went in there using what we had. We wasn't hungry. We didn't eat like Eve, But we put K-rifles to bed because we saw what they had. They didn't have nothing. And then we realized how good we had it. But we gave them K-rifles, and they ate it. Well, they appreciated it. They were really proud and good. And they were starving, really starving. And well, that was it. I mean, they told us to give them anything we wanted to, and don't mistreat him bad in New Hale. That's what that officer come up to us too. That these boys, these people have been through hell. So you do all you can for them. If you got anything that you think they could eat, anything, give it to them. Give it to them. If you want it back, they don't put down and pay you back. Because I don't remember anybody ever want anything back. So, but anyhow, that things like that go on. Camp, like I said, was wired in. But whenever he built that lock for us, we went in there, and them people was, like I said, now they was actually, this thing was, you could, they was shooting, putting flamethrowers on, and then some of these people was hanging on wire, so they tried to get out of there and just get hazy. Rest of these going off. And that's the way they're doing the sun. And don't let nobody tell you that there was no such thing as atrocity, because they did. I've heard people say, oh, they didn't do nothing like that. But they're damn liars. I know they did.
That's it. You're gonna have to start.
So, tell me, did your parents talk much about the war when y'all were coming up?
No,
Not at all? How old was he when he went over?
He was 18.
He was
when
18.
drafted.
yeah.
And he didn't talk about war, at least not in front of his children. He told our mother about things, and she told us, after he died, I learned more about what actually happened over there. But he didn't talk. I overheard him several times when we talked to some of his neighbors, male neighbors, told them about the war. His voice was very loud, his hearing was gone.
Oh, she's here.
Yeah, because of the war. But anyway, so I think we heard bits and pieces, but we didn't really understand it, I don't think, until we got a bit older. And I certainly didn't know about a lot of that stuff involved with Daddy until after he died.
He only talked to me about it when we were on our trip in Anzio. And I guess it brought back the memories of going into Dachau, and it wasn't about Anzio, it was about Dachau. And it was about the stench walking into the city and just the horrific scenes, and maybe a little retribution from the U.S. military.
Where all did y'all visit when y'all went over there?
We went to Rome. Of course, we saw all the sights, the Vatican and all that. We saw the Trevi Fountain. It was after we left there when Daddy got his pockets picked. and then, of course, we went down to Anzio, and we went down to Naples and Pompeii and Sorrento, what they call the Amalfi Coast, which is, and I've been all over Italy, and it's all pretty, but it don't get any prettier than that. We could look out and see the Isle of Capri. So, yeah.
You're talking about.
So that was in the 90s, when Dad was in his 60s.
Okay.
And not in the greatest of health, but he seemed to have that third gear when we got into Italy.
And that was actually the second time he went back, because he went with my mother and made a trip to Dachau.
Yeah.
He talked about the smell, and he could still smell. But
Wow.
I'll tell you something that's ironic. He didn't talk to us about this, but he wanted us all to go over there. Several times he talked about wanting to go over, wanted us to go over to see. And Audie took him back, and as I said, he went with my mother over there and visited some of those places he'd seen. But it was not something we grew up listening to.
He made a friend at the museum or something too.
We took the day after he got his pockets picked in Rome, we took a train to Anzio, which is just south of Rome. And we got off and we walked up to the museum there, and it was closed. And I had looked online, and it wasn't supposed to be closed. So we knocked on the door. A lady comes to the door, and she says, so we explained to her that we'd come from America. She says, come back in 1 hour. So the museum was kind of up on the hill. The train was here, and the museum was here, and then you go down the hill to the seashore where the soldiers landed back in the 40s. So we went down and got some coffee, and when we came back up and we walked through the gates, they were big, military style gates, very nice. Alfredo, who was the museum manager, who became my dad's friend, came out and saluted Dad. And he took us that whole day. He spent the whole day, took us to his home, took us in his car to the cemetery, which was beautiful, just gorgeous, 8,000 headstones, just
Wow. beautiful.
And then we went to eat, and did I tell you the story of that spaghetti? It was the guy's name was Alfredo, and he was the museum manager. Well, when he was 15, the Germans came in,
Okay.
and the Germans had the pointed boots with the blades on the end of them, and they were real mean to the local people. So as we got to meet Alfredo and got to know him a little bit better, I think when we got to his home, he pulls up his pant leg, and he has a scar, like from his knee down to his ankle. And that's where one of those Germans had kicked him with that blade. He was 15 years old.
You said that was in Italy, right?
That was in Anzio, Italy. Yeah.
Wow.
And then Alfredo was, of course, the museum manager, but when he was 15 is when this happened. So he was always partial to American soldiers. So when he heard American soldier coming in, I mean, he took us to lunch and rode us all over the cemetery and took us to his son's clothing store on the ocean front and met his family. And then afterwards, he and Mom and Dad developed a male phone relationship, and Alfredo liked juicy fruit. So they would go buy big boxes full of juicy fruit and send them to him.
Really?
Yeah, yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
I know in his oral history, or at least in the part that I've included, he just talks about Dachau, which is in Germany. In Anzio, Italy, that was a different battle engagement. They call it the Battle of the Caves. So
Okay.
that was what they got the presidential unit.
That was on the way up to Dachau.
Okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
they started out in Sicily, and that's where Daddy started out in Sicily, and then went in to Anzio, and Anzio was a big bay. So, and I think there were 3 or 4 ships trying to get in, and the Germans had this long cannon on the hillside overlooking the bay, and they were shooting out there, and it was hard for the Americans to fight their way in. And that's what our dad had to do along with the other soldiers, and there were, a lot of people killed. But
Daddy,
yeah.
he went through 5 campaigns. I think
Okay.
they only mentioned 3, there were 5 campaigns.
But they drove up and they went up through France, and then they went up into, and they liberated Dachau. But it was
Okay.
in that same group, I guess. He might have moved from group, I think Daddy moved from group to group, but,
Yeah,
Okay. I just want to explain the
he was
separation.
primarily in the, I would say, 45th Infantry.
45th Infantry,
Second
157th Regiment.
157th Regiment.
Yeah.
That was the primary place.
And it was the 5th Army,
Mhm.
so.
Okay.
In the Battle of the Caves, wasn't there lots of people killed, lots of soldiers killed?
There were a lot of people killed. And the thing about Anzio was
They
that,
held that
I think the Americans miscalculated how strong the Germans were. And they went in there thinking that they didn't have enough soldiers, and enough artillery, enough weapons to push them out. And I think it was a tougher fight than what the Americans thought it was going to be.
It's a very famous battle,
Yeah.
and very few people made it out alive. And Daddy was one of them, wounded, but he survived it. And that is when they received his unit received the Presidential Unit Citation,
Okay.
which was a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought.
But again, they held their ground. And you look it up and read, there's a tremendous amount of information about it, but it was a terrible, terrible battle that they lived through. And that's the one, as I said, where the hand grenade came and blew the other man on top of Daddy. And he actually survived, I believe. And Daddy received, that's where he, I think, might have lost his hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do remember
You would
him
hear him,
talking
you
loud.
would hear him 3 blocks down the road if he was here.
Yeah, he was a
He
talker.
could talk loud.
One thing I always remember him talking about was, it was, the happier times when they would have those USO shows and they would have celebrities come over. And I don't know if you've ever seen Casablanca, but he saw Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman.
He had some, autographs. I don't know whatever happened to him, but he was so.
He told Ingrid Bergman that she was just the prettiest lady that he had ever seen.
Yeah, he wasn't shy about talking.
And he said that she said, "Oh, thank you," and then she kissed him on the cheek or something like that.
Big deal.
Yeah.
Plain as day.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's what I remember. So.
tell me, how does it feel about the legacy of having a parent that fought in the World War, Second World War?
They've forgotten, people forget about what happened. They don't understand. And like I say, I didn't even realize the legacy until I was older, because, we grew up during the 60s and there were so many other things going on. Of course, time moves on and other things occur, and people don't think about what they have now, thanks to those people in World War II. That was the greatest generation, that's their name. And we don't realize what they earned for us. We just take it, so many of us today, not all of us I think, but so many people take it for granted, and they don't realize what could have been.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think we're all very proud of not only Daddy, but other family members. Audie could tell you quite a few family members from the war. But we know what they did. We understand what rights we have. And to be honest with you, in today's world, I'm just a little bit alarmed at what's happening in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people tend to forget when these rights were won,
Mm-hmm.
and they're.
We have another brother, and I can remember back in the mid to late 60s when the Vietnam War was going along pretty good. Well, Marsha's the oldest, and then there's another brother, Wanda, and then me. I'm the baby. So our brother was, it was when the Vietnam War and droughts were coming around pretty good, and I think he had a reasonably high draft number.
He did.
So I can remember that it was just us three guys sitting. We had a downstairs we were sitting at the breakfast table, and my brother talking about how concerned he was that his number may come up. And so they actually discussed a little bit about enlisting. So our brother actually did enlist and retired through the Air Force as a major. But I can remember Daddy saying, well, as bad as World War II was, this crazy Vietnam War is maybe even worse.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just concerned like any father would. Me, I came along and the draft went away. I think I was the first year they didn't draft numbers.
Well, and actually, Buck, he was in college and his grades were good.
Yeah.
And as long as, he was in school and his grades were good, but it didn't stop. He still, I don't know what brought it about, but as I always said, I came home one night and there he was sitting there talking to my mother and talking about he had just enlisted.
Yeah.
And she was doing everything in the world, talking about
Yeah.
it.
No, you don't.
Well, let's see. So, when y'all were growing up, I know he didn't talk much about it, but what did he do when he came back from the war? What did he go? Did he go into the mills?
Worked into the mills, yeah.
And that was what mills was he at? I know it wasn't.
They grew up in
That was
Manchester.
Callaway, the
Yeah.
Callaway was at that
Yeah.
time. That
Yeah.
later-
Yeah, they were 16 when they moved to Manchester, and he started work there where our grandparents worked, his mom and dad, and others, in the other side of the family, mama's side of the family. Just about everybody were there.
I think it was a lot like Thomas
And
did.
Dad was
Sounds
there,
like it.
8th grade education, and that's where he stayed till he closed.
Although he did go to school.
He did go to trade school.
Trade school,
Yeah.
he went to trade school. And he didn't finish, but he had to commute. He was back and forth, and that was a long drive. I think something happened to the car, and that ended his education right there.
Wow.
So,
Did he use the GI Bill?
GI Bill.
Okay.
Mhm.
That's what I thought.
And so Was there anything in the recordings that surprised y'all?
It's hard for me to listen to when he talks about the prisoners and.
Daddy he was real weak and sick, and sometimes he had a hard time remembering, but surprisingly, sometimes he was very clear on what he saw, and I remember my sisters went with me, but when we were on the trip to Italy, he was very clear and candid about what he saw and did in Dachau.
Were there stories that he shared after he went back and visited Dachau?
He shared no, not afterwards. I mean, he did, I do remember him talking about coming back and you could still smell the ovens. And, you know, the huge number of train cars with all those rotting corpses, and there were people, it was the horror of the Dachau. But, I don't know, he didn't really, like I say, ever really shared so much of what happened, the terrible instance, just that I was there and so on. I gotta tell you one incident though. It cropped to mind. I mentioned it to Dolly last night. After the war was over and they were still in Germany, life was beginning to come back, and this was before he returned home. He went to the movie theater when he was still a soldier over there waiting to return home. And anyway, he saw a movie. It was Jane Eyre. It was a black and white version, came out in the 40s, and it was a new movie back then. Anyway, didn't like it. He walked across the street, got a beer, and went back. And anyway, when I was later, many years later, I was sitting there talking to my mother about, teaching Jane Eyre, and my dad was watching TV, and, you know, I thought he was watching TV. The minute I mentioned Jane Eyre, he said, Jane Eyre. And he stopped and told me the story of Jane Eyre. And he said, oh yeah, that's so-and-so and so-and-so, when he talked about having seen that. And I thought that was an interesting memory that he had coming from the war. I guess one of the lighter moments. And you might want to mention the cow, too. Another lighter moment after the
Picture of
war.
the cow. Here we go. Tammy, can you hand that over?
One thing I'd like to add is that my daddy fought that war until his last breath.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
He
did.
was still fighting that war when he was dying.
That's a picture of some soldiers, one of them's our dad, buying some cows.
Which one, you said that
That's
one?
my daddy right there pulling that cow.
I'm pretty sure that's him right there.
He
Why was
pointed
he
it out
pulling
to
the
us, it was a
cow?
long
That's
time,
just-
years ago. But anyway, to tell you that they
He talked
we thought,
about that.
Bought the cows, we thought, you know, bought the cows, sure. But it really says that they bought the cows, actually two of them, and took them back to the,
So they could
so
eat
they
them.
could have a nice meal.
Okay. That's funny.
So they could eat,
Yeah.
so they could eat steak.
Good thing about that. Well, he talks about, also in the oral
Timeline.
history, yeah, he talks about.
That's Time Warner, the Italian campaign.
Yeah. He talks about his K rations and how they had cream of wheat in there and how he hated cream of wheat.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's funny because Chris, you know, he's from California. He loves cream of wheat.
I've never had it.
I've never had it, so that, yeah, we have time for that last one.
And that last one is, if there's anything else that y'all would like to share, anything that's coming back to mind about, anything that he shared or his time or your upbringing, having a father who fought in the war.
Yeah.
Follow up on what Marcia said. He, at night, he, particularly, when he was, last year or so of his life, and we'd go visit him sometimes in the hospital. I can't remember, he was, you know, he had been, medication, they had him out, and he would be fighting, like you said, fighting war, he'd say things.
Reliving the war.
Relive. So it never went away.
He said in his sleep, he would sleep talk.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's hard to talk about these things, but I thank y'all for sharing and for keeping his legacy alive. I mean, you know, it really is important for us all to remember what they fought for.
And one comment too, I don't know if he knew, I never did ask him, but he had an uncle, you were talking about Dal.
Uncle Dal, yeah. Uncle Dal was fighting in the Pacific, and he got captured by the Japanese. And through a series of events, he was on a prisoner of war ship that was torpedoed and sunk by the U.S. And it was our understanding, I think from my dad and others, that there was a code such that if you had prisoners of war on the ship, you flew a flag, so that the bombers and the submarines wouldn't sink your boat. They were not flying it. So the Americans sunk and killed his uncle, who was three years older than our dad.
And the funny thing is, he survived the Bataan Death March. He lived through that. And went to the camp, and then he was loaded on the Shinyo Maru, which is one of the hell ships, Japanese hell ships. They were taking him back, and when this was the one that was so famous because of horror of what happened, there were roughly between 700 and 800 people on that ship, and then the Americans torpedoed the ship, and the captain gave the order to kill all the prisoners. So they dropped hand grenades and they used machine guns down in the
Kill the soldiers, kill the American soldiers.
American soldiers. Out of the roughly, say, 750, there were not quite, there were over, almost 700 died. Some of them made it off the ship, survived, and one of them wrote the story about what had happened to the Shinyo Maru.
And that was the Japanese that did all that?
That was the Americans that
Well, I
did.
know
Oh,
that-
yeah,
yeah.
the Japanese, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But his name was Dallas McDearis. Yeah,
So we don't know if Daddy knew what
call him
happened.
Uncle Dal.
Knew the whole story or what.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if he knew about all that. I'm sure he didn't know until after he came back after the war.
Well, that's all we got time for, but thank you for coming in, I appreciate it
Thank
so
you for
much.
doing this.
Thank you, Mama. Thank you, for coming in. I gotta.
I didn't contribute much.
Yes, you did. You helped raise me.